Good day. My name is Professor Gustav Miller. In this video, we're going to walk through the validity requirements for the creation of a praedial servitude. Foundational to this understanding is the fact that we will have to again use a diagram. The first requirement, the first validity requirement for the creation of a praedial servitude is that there must be two properties, always. These properties have specific names. The one in front of us over here will be referred to as the servient tenement. The one on the far side would be the dominant tenement. The Latin terms for this is praedium serviens and praedium dominans. The way to remember this is that the servient tenement over here serves the dominant tenement, and the dominant tenement receives a benefit. Now, related to this first validity requirement is the fact that there are three sub-principles that apply. The first of which is the principle of utilitas. The principle of utilitas simply means that the servient tenement enhances the utility or the economic function of the dominant tenement. That utility or that economic function can be enhanced in three ways. The first is to enhance accessibility. Let's take this example. The dominant tenement over here does not have access to a public road, which is over here. But the servient tenement over here does have access to the road over here. So the servient tenement can enhance the economic function through providing access to the dominant tenement. Another way through which the servient tenement can enhance the economic function of the dominant tenement is through an increase in its fecundity or fertility. The example is as follows. The servient tenement does have access to water. However, the dominant tenement does not have access to water. So the dominant tenement can obtain access to water by asking the servient tenement to provide it with water through a pipeline of some sort. The last possibility through which the servient tenement can enhance the economic function or utility of the dominant tenement is by increasing its habitability, such as providing access to sunlight, free-flowing air, or a view to the ocean or a mountain of something of that nature. The second principle, which is related to this first requirement, is the principle that this economic function or utility must be served forever or in perpetuity. That is why this sub-principle is called perpetua causa. Simply put, the servient tenement must be in a position to enhance the economic function or utility of the dominant tenement forever. The last sub-principle is the principle of vicinitas. Simply put, it means that these two properties, the servient tenement and the dominant tenement, must be in close proximity to one another. In the urban context, it is really easy to understand this because this will typically be neighboring properties in a neighborhood of some sort with a boundary wall dividing them. In the rural context, this becomes slightly more complex because the distances between these two properties are often vast. So, in the rural context, the vicinitas principle has been relaxed slightly, where these two properties the servient and the dominant tenements do not have to be in close proximity to one another. All right, so the second requirement for the establishment of a praedial servitude is that an owner may not have a servitude over his or her own property. Let's take the same example. We have a servient tenement over here, and we have a dominant tenement over there. However, this property belongs to Brenda as a single owner. This property, the dominant tenement, also belongs to Brenda as a single owner. In this example, because Brenda owns both the servient tenement and the dominant tenement as a single owner, it is impossible for her to create a servitude over her own property. Why? Well, as owner, you already have the most comprehensive real right a person can have to land. It seems entirely illogical to want to create a lesser limited real right for yourself when you already have the most comprehensive right. Let's change the example. Now, the servient tenement is still singly owned by Brenda. However, the dominant tenement is now co-owned by Brenda, it's the same Brenda, her husband David, her son Trevor, and her daughter Jade. Brenda is the single owner, and they are together co-owners. In this example, Brenda can create a servitude in favor of her property as co-owner, because as co-owners, they may not have access to a road that runs over here. So the dominant tenement, where Brenda is a co-owner, can ask for a servitude over Brenda's property here, where she is the single owner, to obtain access to the road that goes over here. Fantastic. We are making really good progress walking through the validity requirements for a praedial servitude. Let's turn to the third validity requirement. The third validity requirement is that, in principle, praedial servitudes are indivisible. They cannot be divided, which means once they are created, in general terms or generales, it operates over the entirety of the servient tenement. So let's use the same example again. We have the servient tenement over here and the dominant tenement over there. If the dominant tenement creates a servitude, a praedial servitude, let's use the example of a right of way to get to a road over here. The servitude will operate in principle over the entirety of the servient tenement. So, if you'll allow me to just draw this right of way. In principle, we're going to try and always draw the rights of way as close to the boundary line as possible. So once we've created the right of way over here, and remember, it is indivisible, so this right of way can move or undulate over the servient tenement in any way. That's the basic principle. This will apply equally when the dominant tenement is divided. So let's consider this. If this dominant tenement is divided in some way, this will effectively increase the burden on the servient tenement. So it can be divided as follows. The dominant tenement could in principle be divided vertically to two properties. This means that while the subdivision of this dominant tenement has access over here, we would have to create another right-of-way for this second subdivision to gain access to the property. And that will have to happen right at the top, over here. You can imagine if the dominant tenement is divided even further, this could get really messy. Consider this example. Now we have the dominant tenement divided into 4 pieces. However, the farthest subdivisions of the dominant tenement will not have access to the road running over here. This means that the existing rights of way will have to be extended in a way similar to this. And the reason for that is because, in principle, the servient tenement remains indivisible. We are moving swiftly through the validity requirements. Let's turn to the 4th validity requirement. The 4th validity requirement is that you may not have a servitude of a servitude. Let's look at an example. Here we have Notukela. The middle property belongs to Luzel, and the farthest property belongs to Edna. Notukela has water. However, Edna does not have water. So Edna approaches Notukela to obtain access to water. Notukela gladly agrees, and a servitude of water is created in favor of Edna. In practical terms, this manifests in the laying of a pipe. Let me draw that for you. We have the pipe being laid from Notukela's property over Luzel's property to the boundary of Edna's property. Why only to the boundary? Because Edna can do on her property whatever she likes. So where is the pipe going? Now it's very important, ladies and gentlemen, to keep in mind the legal relationships over here. Notukela will be the servient tenement. Why? Because she can provide access to water. Luzel will be a servient tenement because although she cannot provide the water herself, she can lead the water to Edna, and Edna will be a dominant tenement. Now, we've laid the pipe, but we've created 2 servitudes. The servitudes are as follows. From Edna's perspective, the first servitude that she has is a servitude of drawing water from Notukela's property over this little distance over here. The second servitude that is created is a servitude of water leading over Luzel's property. So there are 2 servitudes. This means that Luzel is in a very unique position. She is simultaneously a servient tenement to Edna and a dominant tenement to Notukela. Now in this example, Edna requested permission to have access to water. But Luzel also needs water. So she has the allure of simply adding a tap onto the pipeline that is already running over her property. However, that is not allowed. the principle clearly says you may not have a servitude of another servitude. So what Luzelle should do is she should approach Notukela and request a servitude. In this example, there will be another servitude created over the same pipeline, essentially, but this is only one servitude, and it's called a servitude of water drawing. Because remember, since Luzelle's property is adjacent to Notukela's property, all she needs is that short distance to draw the water onto her property where she can do whatever she likes with the water. Fantastic. This brings us to the last validity requirement for the creation of a praedial servitude. Simply put, this requirement states that a praedial servitude cannot impose a positive duty on the servient tenement. Let's look at an example. In this example, we are situated in the Limpopo province. Over here, we are just outside Polokwane, and over here, we are just outside Lepelale. We have a brother, Pius, who has a farm over here and a farm over here. I want you to imagine that there is currently a drought in the Limpopo province. Now, Pius has a herd of about 100 heads of cattle. They are suffering because they do not have access to water. So what he wants to do is he wants to drive his cattle from his one farm over other farms towards his farm over here, and again drive his cattle over the farms here to his brother's farm, Ernst, over here, that is on the border of the Limpopo River. Now the servitude that we will create for this is the servitude of trekpath. And this could operate something like this. So how would this servitude of trekpath work? Let's consider this. So Pius starts on his farm and meanders with his 100 heads of cattle over, let's say, 5 farms between his farm and his farm over here. This means that this farm is a dominant tenement and these farms are servient tenements. The servitude of trekpath enables Pius to not only drive his cattle over these farms, but when they rest at the end of the day, that the animals, the heads of cattle, can feed on the grass available to them. So Pius makes good progress onto his own farm, and there he can do whatever he likes with his cattle. The challenge remains for him now to go from his farm over here to his brother's farm over here. This they will do again in terms of a servitude of trekpath. Let's consider. Again, they meander over the intervening farms. And this route, you will notice, is not a straight line, because you will recall from earlier on in this video that in principle, praedial servitudes are indivisible, so they can operate over the entirety of the servient tenements. The reason why it's also not a straight line is sometimes the topography of the land will not allow them to walk in a straight line or drive the cattle in a straight line. Again, when Pius drives his cattle over these intervening farms, when they rest, the heads of cattle can feed on the grass available to them. But the principle I want to illustrate here is Pius cannot insist that the owners of these farms provide them with feed. Remember, we are operating during a drought. That would be a positive obligation. So now, Pius has arrived at his brother's farm, right next to the Limpopo River, where there is water. However, as we know, brotherly love can sometimes be very weird. And so, Pius insists that his cattle, his 100 heads of cattle, be kept separate from his brother's heads of cattle. And so therefore requests Ernst that when he arrives there should be a separate kraal for his heads of cattle. That, too, will not be allowed, because the building of a kraal to house or accommodate Pius's cattle would be a positive obligation. What would be allowed is for Pius to just request his brother Ernst not to interfere with his animals' access to the Limpopo River and the water available to it.